Her life was, well, it was a bridge across an entire century of American history. I mean, she was a wartime union clerk, a record store pioneer, a civil rights activist, and a national park ranger, a career she didn't even start until she was 85 years old. This is the incredible and way too often overlooked story of Betty Reid Soskin.
So, let's dive right in. You hear National Park Ranger, and you probably think of mountains and forests, right? Not the industrial workforce? But what if I told you that these two worlds are deeply, deeply connected, all through the life of one amazing woman?
And here it is. This is the link. Betty's story doesn't start in a park. It starts right in the heart of the industrial boom with the Boilermakers Union. Now these folks, they were the ones focused on shipbuilding and metal fabrication, and they really laid the groundwork for so many of the skilled trades we count on today, from welding to industrial HVAC. So her journey? It isn't just Black history or women's history, it's a crucial piece of the history of the American workforce.
Okay, so to really understand the woman she became, this absolute force of nature who literally reshaped how we see our history, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning.
So Betty was born in 1921, and her life was shaped by these massive historical events from day one. I mean, can you imagine being just 6 years old and the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 just wipes out your family's home and their business? It's just gone. That disaster is what pushed them west to Oakland, California, as part of the Great Migration. And by 1942, a young Betty was ready to do her part and join the war effort on the home front.
You know, we often hear the story of the WW2 home front as this big tale of American unity. But for Betty, and for countless other African Americans, the reality was, well, it was completely different. It was a world of opportunity, sure, but it was also a world of rigid and often very dangerous segregation.
Betty got a job as a file clerk for the Boilermakers Union A-36. Now, this is where the story gets really complicated. A-36 was an all-Black auxiliary union, and what that meant was its members, who were absolutely vital to the war effort, were totally denied full membership and voting rights in the main union. So they did the work, but they were shut out from having any of the power.
And this inequality, it wasn't just about rights on paper, it was about life and death. In the segregated military and workforce, Black men were consistently given the most hazardous jobs, and one of the most dangerous jobs of all? Loading tons and tons of ammunition and explosives onto ships headed for the Pacific.
320. That number, it represents the number of people who were lost in a single, horrifying moment. A moment that just ripped the lid off the lethal reality of this segregated system.
So in July 1944, at Port Chicago, just miles from where Betty was working, 2 ships being loaded with ammunition just exploded. The blasts killed 320 people. And get this, a staggering 2/3 of them were the Black enlisted men who were forced to do that dangerous work. This tragedy, it became a flashpoint. The survivors refused to keep working under those same unsafe conditions, and the trial that followed became this major catalyst that helped push for the eventual desegregation of the entire U.S. Armed Forces.
After the war, Betty didn't just, move on. She started to build. Together with her husband Mel, she forged a whole new path, creating a cultural legacy and finding new ways to fight for a more just America. In 1945, Betty and her husband Mel opened Reid's Records. And it wasn't just one of the first Black-owned music stores in California, it was a sanctuary. It specialized in gospel music and what they called race records back then, the blues and R&B that were often totally ignored by white-owned shops. For nearly 75 years, that store was a vital cultural anchor for the entire community. Then, in the 50s, the family moved to the all-white suburb of Walnut Creek, trying to find better schools for their kids. They weren't welcomed. In fact, they were met with the most horrific racism, including death threats. But in the face of all that trauma, Betty found her voice. She started writing songs, these really powerful, poetic songs about her experiences. And that creative act, it fueled her activism. She became a prominent voice in the civil rights movement.
Decades later, a whole new chapter began, one she never, ever saw coming. At an age when most people are long retired, Betty took on the mission that would make her a national icon, correcting the story of America itself.
And this, right here, this gets to the absolute heart of her mission. We all know the popular image of Rosie the Riveter, right? But that was a white woman's story. It was all about unity and triumph, and it completely erased the experiences of Black women like Betty. She knew the real story, the one with segregated unions, racial tension, and systemic inequality, was being totally left out of the history books. So how did she fix this? Her journey was just incredible. While she was working for some state assembly members, she ended up in planning meetings for the new Rosie the Riveter National Historical Park, and as the only person of color in the room, she just refused to let them tell an incomplete story. She insisted that the park's narrative had to include the painful truths of segregation. Her voice was so powerful, so undeniable, that it turned her first into a consultant for the park, and then, at 85 years old, a full-time national park ranger.
She really said it best herself. I was 85 before I became a park ranger. I retired at 100. For her, every phase of her life, the union hall, the record store, the protests, they weren't separate chapters. They were all layers of experience that came together to give her this voice of just unparalleled wisdom.
So, what's the ultimate legacy of a life lived so fully, so fiercely? Well, it all came together in this final, powerful act of recognition. One that wasn't driven by politicians, but by the very generation she worked so hard to inspire.
So, in 2021, students at a local middle school started doing their own research. They looked into their school's namesake, a Spanish missionary named Juan Crespi, and they uncovered the violent, oppressive history of the California mission system. They decided his name did not reflect their values at all, and it was the students themselves who led the charge to make a change.
And so, on her 100th birthday, surrounded by the community she had served for decades, Betty Reid Soskin cut the ribbon. The school was officially renamed in her honor. A life that was spent fighting to be seen and to be heard, now immortalized as a place of learning for generations to come. How amazing is that?
Really, this all comes down to her personal mantra. Betty understood that history isn't just some fixed set of facts in a book. It's a story. And for way too long, the people telling that story, the ones in the room doing the remembering, had left her and so many others completely out of it. She spent the better part of a century fighting her way into that room. Betty's life is just this incredible testament to the power of a single voice to completely reshape our collective memory. She fought to make sure her story, in all its truth and all its complexity, was finally told. Her legacy leaves all of us with one really vital question. Whose story is still out there, just waiting to be heard?